Thank you. Hello everyone. I declare the meeting of the City Planning and Environment Committee meeting open at 6:33 p.m. Everyone at this meeting is reminded to conduct themselves in a polite and professional manner, keep communication factual, use appropriate language and tone, do not use any defamatory or derogatory remarks. I also ask councillors to observe the requirements under the Code of Meeting Practice and Meeting Etiquette, including debate on an item will commence only once we have a mover and seconder for the item. The mover of the recommendation motion has first right to speak on the item. The mover has a right of a reply before the recommendation motion is put to a vote. Raise your hand to indicate you wish to speak, as I'll determine the speaking order based on the hands as I see them. Please indicate whether you are speaking for or against the item. You can speak for up to 5 minutes on a motion and a similar time for any amendment. For the efficient conduct of this meeting, it's not necessary for you to repeat the matters you agree with and raised by any previous speaker. It's sufficient for you to say that you agree with the points raised. I also remind you that the video recording is an official record of council and may be made available to persons upon request in accordance with the Government Information Public Access Act 2009. No other recordings are permitted. So we'll start with the agenda and an acknowledgement of country as agenda item 1. Bayside Council respects the traditional custodians of the land, elders past, present and emerging, on which this meeting takes place, and acknowledges the Gadigal and Bidjigal clans of the Sydney Basin. So on to item number 2, apologies and attendance. We've received an apology from Councillor Saravanosky. Are there any other apologies or requests for leaves of absence? Would someone like to move and second the apology be granted? Moved by Councillor Curry, seconded by Councillor Douglas. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. All those against, please say against. I declare the motion carried. Item number 3, disclosures of interest. I remind councillors that you should also notify the General Manager in advance of the meeting of any disclosures of interest so that the Minutes Secretary can prepare them on the screen. Any disclosures of interest must also be made at the meeting. Are there any councillors who wish to disclose an interest? Thank you, councillors. The disclosures... Oh, sorry. I have it that no councillors wish to disclose an interest. This will be noted in the minutes. Thank you, councillors. On to item 4. There are nil minutes of previous meetings, as this is our first meeting of the Planning and Environment Committee in our wonderful Botany Town Hall. Items by exception. Given that there's 6 items on the agenda, I'll give you the opportunity to deal with items by exception. Does anyone want to deal with any items by exception? Thank you. We'll move on to item 6, public forum. There are no speakers registered for public forum tonight, so we'll move straight on to item 7, reports. So first report is CPE 22.001, draft planning proposal. There's an officer's recommendation before us. Is there a mover and a seconder?
Or does that mean I have to agree to it? Move it?
No.
Okay.
Is there a seconder for the item? So moved by Councillor Werner, seconded by Councillor Douglas. Is there any discussion?
Madam Chair, can I please ask for the council officer to give an overview of this report?
Thank you, Councillor Curry. Through the General Manager, would you like to assign an officer to speak to this item?
So, through the Chair, we have the Manager of Strategic Planning here with us tonight, Claire Harley. I think Claire will be able to speak briefly to the item.
Thank you. Through the chair, the additional permitted uses that were previously included in the Botany Bay LEP, we no longer need those additional. We no longer need those additional permitted uses in the LEP. They relate to site permissibility of residential flat buildings for sites where bonus provisions were applied. Under the way the LEP came about, those the Department of Planning sought for us to remove them as part of the standardisation of the LEP. That didn't occur, but they do need to be removed now because they are, I suppose, in some ways obsolete. So additional permitted uses mean that the uses apply only to those sites that are identified in the schedule. So to some extent this is administrative in that it will remove those controls from the LEP and then the underlying controls stay in place. So essentially the bonus provisions will be removed.
Thank you.
Can I, through the chair, have what consultation has taken place with those residents?
Through the chair, there was a period of time some years ago when there was quite extensive consultation undertaken in relation to a series of properties to which additional permitted uses, the bonus provisions applied. That consultation was undertaken by the City of Botany Bay, I believe, and then this matter has always also been to the local planning panel at the end of last year. It hasn't been on exhibition. That would be the next step, subject to council resolving to progress the draft planning proposal, at which case we would then consult with the community more generally.
Thank you. Councillor Werner.
Could I ask, Chair, so these sites, APU 34 and 35 are deleted, but then it also says that they will be amended on page 3 to ensure permissibility of residential flat buildings for sites where bonus provisions apply. Yeah, so I wasn't quite sure why they were deleted and then why they would be changed.
Through you, Madam General Manager.
To the director.
Through you, Director.
Thank you, Chair. Perhaps if I can frame it in a slightly different way. In the previous Botany LEP, residential flat buildings were allowed in the R2 and R3 zones. When Council was looking at putting its new LEP together, Council wanted to take those uses out of those zones so they were no longer permitted. At the time, the Department of Planning said they weren't prepared to do that until Council had done its local housing strategy and made clear that they could provide that housing in another way, in other zones. So the LEP went through with these two provisions in it that preserve the right for residential flat buildings to be in zones R2 and R3 in former Botany. But the intention was always to come back after the local housing strategy was done and seek to have them taken out. And that's what this LEP is essentially about. There were those 6 properties listed in there that had previously been through an urban design process and Council had accepted previously that they could accommodate residential flats even though they were in those lower density zones. And the intention was always that that would be carried forward, that those sites were still suitable. So what's happening in this plan is that the potential for those 6 is being preserved. So they didn't need to be identified as being suitable for residential flat buildings in the current plan because they're permitted in all R2 and R3 zones, whereas in the future they won't be. So that the right for these 6 to be developed for residential flat buildings needs to be preserved if that's what Council wants to carry forward. So those 6 sites also have an FSR bonus that applies only to those sites because that's previously been examined and found to be to deliver a good outcome. So yeah, in essence, R2 and R3 will no longer be allowed for residential flat development apart from the 6 sites.
Thank you, Director.
Thank you.
Is there any further discussion?
Yeah, through you, Chair, can I ask if we can add an additional number 3, and that is to inform the affected property owners when it goes out on exhibition, please?
Thank you, Councillor Curry. So if there's no further discussion, I put that the recommendation motion on the screen, moved by Councillor Werner and seconded by Councillor Douglas, be moved with Councillor Curry's amendment, which is that the council inform the affected property owners when the matter is on public exhibition. All those in favour of the motion say aye.
Aye.
All those against the motion say against. I declare...
Yes, sorry, I still don't really quite understand some of the detail. But I guess that there might be an opportunity in the council meeting to talk some more about it.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Werner. So I declare the motion carried. So we move on to the next report, which is CPE 22.002, Improvements to Flood Risk Assessment and Flood Hazard Mitigation in Bayside LGA resulting from increased rainfall and rising sea levels. Is there a mover and a seconder? Moved by Councillor Douglas, seconded by Councillor Curry. Is there any discussion?
Yeah, again, through you, Chair, can we ask for the appropriate officer? I'm not sure if are these working?
Yep, they
Thank you. Could we just ask for an overview of this report, please, for the committee?
Through you, Director, are you able to provide an explanation or summary of the report?
Sure, Chair, happy to do
Thank you.
that. Council is in the process of updating a number of flood studies in Bayside, as we do every now and then to make sure they're up to date with the most recent information. As part of that process, the consultant who's doing that work for us and doing the modelling has asked us which parameters we'd like to include in terms of rainfall and also sea level rise due to climate change. Bayside doesn't have an adopted position on those matters, in particular sea level rise. And so this report is just really flagging a piece of work that we need to do to come back to Council to have some direction set around which rainfall data we're going to incorporate. There's a new series of rainfall data out, and also which targets or which parameters we'll set for sea level rise. There's a number of scenarios that Council could adopt in terms of the level of climate change that we expect, and they affect the sea level rise and therefore the parameters that go into the flood studies that we're doing. So this is a new piece of work, and I guess we're just bringing it to Council's attention that it's something that we'd like to do. There is funding available for it through the stormwater levy. So if Council is happy for us to go ahead with that, that report would be completed and then brought back to Council for a decision on those particular matters.
Thank you, Director.
Thank you, Chair. So can I just clarify in relation to when we're considering, obviously we've had, it's been a hard time across many areas of the state at the moment, and I know we've done numerous flood studies over recent years and in relation to, in response to the events. So I guess to what extent do, where we record our hotspots, and then to what extent are those hotspots then incorporated into, identified I guess, and then incorporated into how we're going to address these areas and what the plan is in order to achieve that?
Through you, Director, can you...
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so information, the models are quite sophisticated, so they look at a whole range of things as inputs. So historical flood data is one thing that is used in the models. It's also around topography, a mapping of the drainage system, and then rainfall data and all sorts of other things as well. There's assumptions about the percentage of pipes that are blocked and a whole lot of things that are built into it. Yes, real life data in terms of where flooding occurs is definitely fed into those considerations. So the process is generally that a flood study is done, which identifies areas that are a problem. There's then a risk analysis done to see which areas are the worst in terms of depth and speed of water and things like that. And then the third step is to look at mitigation options. So that's where we look at ways that we can help reduce the impacts, and then they're basically modelled on a cost-benefit basis. Some of them are very expensive and don't deliver a lot of benefit, so we look for the ones that will deliver good value for money, and they're the ones that then get funded into the Capital Works program. So that's the general process.
Thank you.
Thank you. Through the chair, so if we're considering, so obviously if I just refer to the next committee, which the agenda item is on stormwater drainage across the LGA. So if we're looking at a strategic approach to targeting those hotspots that we've seen time and time again, is that at where does a plan sit in relation? Is it best placed in under consideration as part of this recommendation, or is it best placed in the other committee report?
Through you, Director.
Yes, Chair, the other matter would be a better one. This one's really just focusing on rainfall data and sea level rise. The other committee is looking at a report that's more broad than that.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Werner.
Thank you. Through the chair, I've been sent some information from someone from the insurance industry, and they are claiming that the even the IPCC data is not really properly up to date, and or that doesn't really show the scenarios that not up to date, but because it's a political organisation, it's a government organisation. Sometimes according to this person, we could be using better or data that's more in line with, for instance, what the insurance industry uses. So. I don't know how accurate this particular information is, but what I would like to know is if the insurance industry uses a scenario that has less risk or that protects us better, would it be possible to use that data instead of this that's the one that's recommended in the business papers, which I believe is assuming 40 centimetres increase by 2050, because I think the insurance industry is saying that it's actually going to be more. So would that be possible?
Through your chair, part of this work will be to look at what the best data is, and we'll come back to council with some information on that. Generally there's a range of scenarios, so depending on how many degrees increasing temperature you pick, that has impacts in terms of the sea level rise and other things, intensity of rainfall, frequency of storms, all that sorts of things. So there's a scenario from kind of best case to worst case, and so and they're supported by different data. So we'll come back with those, and then the challenge for council is to pick where they want to place themselves on that spectrum from worst case to best case, and use that as inputs into our model. So yeah, we'll look at what data's around it and we'll report that back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Barlow.
I think it'd be an amendment, or it might be just a suggestion, that this doesn't come back to a committee, it goes straight to a GM briefing, because it's a waste of time if we have another report and it's so detailed, we need the GM briefing. So I'm saying you're either just a suggestion, or you can make it as part 2, that when the report's completed it goes directly to a GM briefing, because I didn't realise if we move something tonight to go to a GM briefing, we can't do anything until it's ratified at council at the end of the month, so we would delay it all that time. So maybe make it part 1, or a suggestion that it goes to, once the report's finished, it has to go to a GM briefing, instead of coming here and then waiting its turn. Because I think it's fairly important after what's been going on the last 2 weeks. So I'll suggest that either you had it as part 1, 2, the final report goes directly to a GM briefing.
Thank you, Councillor Barlow. Does that sound like a amendment to the motion?
Yes, it is. The councillors that have moved the motion may want to take that on board, or Councillor Barlow will need a seconder for the amendment.
I'm happy to take that on board. I do want to say that I think we discussed the climate emergency at the last council meeting, actually, and there was quite a lot of confusion from some of the councillors about what the impact of climate change, actually will be locally. And I think this report is an opportunity for us to really understand the local impacts and what we need to do as a community to build resilience and also adaptation, but also looking at what measures we can do as a council to also mitigate our own carbon emissions. So I think I'm in support of the amendment because I think this is a very important opportunity for councillors to bed down that knowledge about climate change.
Is there any further discussion? Councillor Werner?
Can I just ask, when you're saying defer it to, or that we talk about it at a GM briefing, do you mean the one that's in a couple of weeks' time?
You cannot refer this on until it's been ratified by council, even though it's tonight. It's a committee meeting. It has to be then go to a full council meeting. So by the time that they do the report, I'm just saying when the report is finalised, don't bring it here and then send it somewhere else. Send it straight to a GM briefing because it's too important just to come here with everyone trying to read it and understand it when you can have it fully explained to everyone that chooses to come.
Thank you, Councillor
Through the
Barlow.
Chair, my understanding is that the report will need to be done and that may take more than 2 weeks anyway, so
That's
it will
correct.
come to the GM briefing once the report is done.
That's correct. So is there any further debate on the amendment? So can I, there being no further discussion, I put the amendment on the screen moved by Councillor Barlow and Councillor Douglas. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say against. I declare the motion carried. Oh, I declare the amendment carried, sorry. Okay, so that's on the...
Councillors, if I could maybe just assist.
Thank you, Madam General Manager.
Sorry, through the chair. The additional words that were added to the original motion can be treated as one draft motion. It's not one or the other. It's actually that officers prepare the report. The report then goes to an information session once it has been constructed before coming back to a further committee meeting. That's actually, what would happen normally would be that the original movers would be asked whether they'd accept Councillor Barlow's additional words. And then you're just voting, you're not voting one or the other, you're voting on it in its totality, which I think sort of made sense from the discussions that you were having.
Thank you for the clarification, Madam. No, thank you for the clarification. Appreciate that. So is there any further discussion on the additional wording to the motion? There being no further discussion, I put the recommendation motion on the screen, moved by Councillors Douglas and Curry. All those in favour of the motion say aye. Aye. All those against the motion say against. I declare the motion carried. So moving on to the next item, which is CPE 22.003, Draft Local Heritage Grant Policy. Is there a mover and a seconder? Councillor Muscat. So moved by Councillor Barlow, seconded by Councillor Muscat. Is there any discussion?
Can I just ask a question, please, through the chair? So just to be clear, the grants are to be paid in retrospect after the work has already been done rather than beforehand.
That's correct.
And is that because we need to ensure that the work has been done to a heritage standard?
Thank you, Councillor Douglas. I believe the application indicated that you need to provide proof of receipts and expenditure, so I assumed it was in retrospect. Thank you. Is there any? Yeah, so this is to approve the draft policy going on exhibition. So is there any discussion?
I mean, I was just going to say, I think it seems like quite a small amount of money for a whole large Bayside area. Why was that, through the chair, why is it such a small pool of money? Is it because it's an experimental grant or?
Through you, Madam General Manager.
Through the chair. A couple of reasons. Yes, this is reinventing the policy that previously existed. The amount is consistent with a former resolution of the council that's probably about 18 months old, that we put approximately $30,000 aside per annum. It's also consistent with what neighbouring councils are funding at the moment. So I think it's really a matter of let's see how this goes, how it works in reality, what the take-up is, what the result is in improving streetscape and, you know, the look and feel of the area, and then council will have the opportunity to review it in the future if you wish to.
Thank you. Can I just ask what sort of previous uptake there has been for the grants program?
It's a long time ago. I know in other councils this is about what is spent per annum. It will obviously require us to do quite a lot of promotion, but also set expectations that it's a small contribution because it is about improving private property. So it's a small contribution to just encourage and support people who have heritage items.
Thank you.
Just through the chair, just for the purposes of people listening, so it's purely for the facade of properties that are street facing?
Yes, so that you can actually see that difference when the funding is used.
Thank you. Is there any other discussion? Would the mover like to exercise her right of reply?
Actually, there was only one comment, and I don't know why the wording is, may also vary the maximum amount that can be applied for. That to me becomes a political football. I think it should be maximum of 3,000, because that gives 10 people a chance. Otherwise, it could come out, it could help you get 5,000. So I prefer it to be set in concrete, because otherwise it could be manipulated, that was all. But I think when it started many, many years ago, it was $1,000. So.
Madam General Manager.
Just to explain the context of those words in the policy, so that each year the council determines how much the total pool of funds are, not the individual grant itself. So it's just the budgetary process.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? By Councillors Barlow and Muscat. All those in favour of the motion say aye. Aye. All those against the motion say against. I declare the motion carried. On to item CPE 22.004, draft submission design and place state environmental planning policy. Is there a mover and a seconder? Moved by Councillor Curry. Seconded by Councillor Werner. I have a mover and a seconder for the recommendation. Is there any discussion?
I have a couple of points. Is there an officer to speak?
I believe there is, Councillor Douglas.
There are mostly questions. Objective 1, which is on page 135, specifically states not to have electric vehicle charging stations in public areas, is my understanding of it. And I just wanted some clarification around the logic of that.
through the director. Can you, what was that page number again, Councillor?
Objective 1.
I have a copy of that.
Through the chair, the reference where it says talks about electric vehicle charging statements in the public realm, I think that's really making reference to public open space, and so that might be Cook's Park, say, that where we would prefer for electric vehicle parking stations to be would be in, say, areas that are already car parking areas. So you don't see further alienation of usable open space. So whether they be public or private car parking spaces, that would be the more appropriate place. Otherwise, we could see a situation where we are alienating grassed areas that are used for recreation.
Okay, that's great. So I'm just through the chair, because when we did the tour of the pool facilities, aquatic centre, was one thing that I suggested was that we could have EV charging stations in the car park there, so that would be admissible.
Well, yes, I suppose it's really that we're trying to protect the open space, but car parking, public car parking places may be appropriate, subject to further council consideration.
Okay, I have one other question, if that's right, through the chair.
Thank you, Councillor Douglas.
Objective 7, it says to avoid conflicts with cycleways, to manage conflicts by sending cycleways on routes away parallel to public transport routes, limit interaction and risk to vulnerable users, bus, car cyclists, or cyclists, pedestrians, and ensure vulnerable users are not put into the conflict with heavy vehicles. I'm just particularly interested in the bit managing conflicts by sending cycleways on routes away parallel to public transport routes. And it says above that, sorry, the cycle network should be prioritising secondary streets, not main streets or streets with bus zones. As a cyclist myself, who relies on a bike to get around, I have to go to main streets to do my business. I can't always be in a parallel street when I want to arrive. So I don't understand why you'd be pushing cycleways to secondary streets and not creating a pathway that also helps to minimise the amount of car traffic going into a shopping area and therefore the less need for parking. We need to be encouraging active transport rather than pushing it to back streets, in my mind. It's a question.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Douglas. Ms Healy, do you have a response? Harley, sorry for that.
Okay, yes, through the chair. The comment really in there is, I suppose, at that level where you're starting to do place making, and it's obviously place by place. The comment would be around trying to minimise conflict. So we have some areas in our LGA where we have black spots where cyclists are coming into conflict with heavy trucks. We do have a lot of heavy trucks. So we would like to make sure that that's managed well. So we have, working with the Transport for New South Wales, and they have a place and movement hierarchy, and that's what we will be working with. So this comment probably is talking, I don't think it probably adequately reflects the fact that we're working through that. So it's talking about creating places. In some places in this LGA, that conflict, we can't necessarily keep those cyclists on the same route as some of our very, very heavy traffic because it's not really appropriate. And I think that's, if you've got a very strong residential environment and potentially a neighbourhood centre or a local centre, then you obviously have the cyclists working in with the pedestrians, but we have to manage conflict. And so that comment really, I think, is around that sort of management it's place-based.
So could I make a suggestion through the chair that maybe there be some clarification around what Main Streets is, that it's not high streets? My understanding of a high street is a shopping village, whereas a Main Street could be mistaken for that.
Yep, we'll take that on notice and make the amendment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Through the chair, Councillor Douglas, as a member of the motion, I'm happy to add an additional amendment which makes the point of putting in, what was the wording you used?
To clarify that we're not talking about high streets when we're talking about objective 7 in terms of pushing cyclists
So
away
clarifying the terminology around
Main Streets and high streets.
Councillor Werner?
Through the chair, I was wondering if we could also compare how this compares to other councils, because I know that when I used to ride to uni, I used to ride through City of Sydney, I think, and it's Burke Street, I believe, is one of those big streets. It does have a cycleway, and it's quite convenient because it goes, it's a long street, and so, it's very convenient to use as a cyclist, but there are a lot of trucks as well because it's in Alexandria. So perhaps if we can just compare with other councils so that we don't sort of limit the places where we could possibly put cycleways.
Thank you, Councillor Werner. I believe this is a submission to the state environmental planning policy coming from Bayside, so I'm not sure. I'll take it from staff to answer whether it's appropriate to do a comparison for a submission. Can staff please answer?
Chair, you're correct. It is a submission on the state policy. So I guess we're just conveying Bayside's comments on that. Other councils, I guess, will do the same.
Thank you.
Yeah, through the chair, I have to agree with Greta's, Councillor Werner, a comment. I use that cycleway often myself, and it is running through an industrial area, but the cycleway is separated very safely, and it's a fantastic route. You can get right into the city within 20 minutes. It's faster than driving, in fact. So I don't actually have a problem with riding alongside trucks if there is a safe delineation.
Thank you, Councillor Douglas. I do believe for the purposes of this submission, this is a Bayside opinion on a state policy. We're not developing Bayside policy yet. So thank you for those comments.
Yeah, I understand that, but I do think that we are making a submission about what we are representing, and I do think that we do need to represent the diversity of those experiences in what we're pushing forward. Yes.
Can I ask Ms Harley to respond to that?
Could I say something?
Oh, sorry,
I won't be
Madam General
technical.
Manager.
I won't be technical at all.
Thank you.
Just reading Objective 7, I don't think that what the staff have constructed and what's been said tonight are in conflict. I think where councillors are describing a very safe separation of cycleway from other vehicles, we could include that in here. What we're really talking about is generally where we can't achieve that because of the width of our roads, because they're state roads and we're not able to do that. So I would suggest that perhaps we would resolve the issue if we said where full and safe separation cannot be achieved, the cycleway network should be prioritised in secondary streets. And that way we've covered everybody.
Thank you.
Comfortable with that?
Thank you. So, Councillor Curry, are you, as the mover of the motion, are you happy to accept those additional words?
I am. Thank you, Chair.
Is there any further discussion? So there being no further discussion, I put the recommendation on the screen moved by Councillors Curry and Werner. All those in favour of the motion say aye. Aye. All those against the motion say against. I declare the motion carried. On to item CPE 22.005, submission to employment zones reform. Is there a mover and a seconder? Moved by Councillor Douglas, seconded by Councillor Barlow. Is there any discussion?
Yeah, through the chair, can I ask for a summary from the appropriate council officer, please?
Thank you, Councillor Curry. Can I ask for an officer summary?
Do you want me to do it? Through the chair. So the state government has embarked on quite a significant range of planning reforms, and this is one of them. Looked at the employment zones in the standard instrument, which is what it is called the base, I suppose, planning controls that the state government had created. So council's Bayside's local environmental plan is based on the standard instrument. The state government has the capacity to go and make changes to that standard instrument that automatically can change LEPs across the state. They can also take into account council submissions about their own local environmental plan. So what they've done in this instance is undertaken to do reform of employment zones in the standard instrument. So they've got an agenda to try and improve how employment zones work. So employment is not just employment, but it's all the activities that happen in those zones. So business-related activities, all of those sort of industrial and business zones going into employment zones. What they did was, for each council, they did a draft translation. So they took our existing LEP, Local Environmental Plan, and said, under our new reforms, we propose to go to this. So what this submission is doing is really saying, we've looked at to the Department of Planning, we've looked at what you've proposed for us, and we think this is okay, and that is we're not comfortable with that. So it's quite technical. There's quite a bit of technical detail in there. There'll be some uses where the Rockdale and the former Rockdale and former Botany LEPs didn't say the same thing, and we've tried to work out what is the best way forward to promote employment, to promote business activity, but not impact the amenity of the businesses or the people who live in the area and the environment. So that's overall, I suppose, what's happening with this one.
Thank you for the explanation. Councillor Curry?
Thank you, Chair. Through the chair, so what would be the main points where, on what has been changed, and then so that the committee can understand and what those potential impacts are on the areas where that is actually occurring?
I suppose some areas you've got changes where they're looking at, well, there's one of the main things is they're changing the name of the zones. They're collapsing some of the, I suppose, the uses in there. So you're seeing some changes in the B1 and the B2 zones, what are currently that, and they're becoming a one zone. So at the moment you might have areas where we've got B1, which is a neighbourhood centre, and we've also got B2, which is a slightly bigger centre. And they're turning that into one local centre. Now, in some areas in New South Wales and Bayside included, that very small zone, the B1, was applied to the smallest centres. And that we tried to use that zone to manage the impacts and the amenity impacts on the surrounding land uses. So they've collapsed that into one, and we've had to make some judgment calls on what does that actually mean around amenity, what do we think is an appropriate scale for that broader area. So to some extent they've taken away some of that nuance that you might have seen with having more zones.
Thank you. Any further discussions?
Just a question. We've got a timeline, I think, of April. Is there any chance, this is fairly important because they're just pushing away what industrial land we have, Are we losing any of the industrial land like Torella, or are we yeah?
Thank you, Ms Harley.
So through the chair, no, this isn't proposing to rezone any of the industrial land. So
It isn't?
no, it's a translation of it's looking at the actual wording in the local environmental plan and what zones we would then have moving forward. Industrial land is not being rezoned as part of this, and in fact the Department of Planning is still
just
going
hard to
through a
understand.
reform.
It's a detailed report and it's very hard to really understand, but if you had time it should go to another GM briefing because it's a very important document.
Thank you, Councillor Barlow. So do any of these changes disadvantage current zonings?
Madam Chair, if I could, our intention through this is really to try and maintain the status quo as best we can. We weren't looking to make any policy changes or significant shifts in what people can and can't do. As was said, the zones are being collapsed into a smaller number, so there is some fine grain that's lost in there. So there is a slight broadening, I would say, in some zones of the things that you can do now. There's nothing radically different, and we've tried. This report talks about additional permitted uses as well, as one of the earlier reports did. So we've tried to use that mechanism to carry forward as best we can exactly what's in our current LEP. So to try and bring back some of that fine grain by using additional permitted uses clauses, by saying in some areas you can and can't do certain things, even though in the broader zoning changes they're saying that you can. So we're not sure that the Department will accept all of those because they are trying to broaden things out and simplify them, but our position really has been to just try and maintain the status quo as best we can. With some of the changes in definitions and that sort of thing, there is some slight broadening in some areas of what you can do in some zones.
Thank you, Director Barlow. Councillor Werner.
Thank you. Through the chair. So I take it this is a submission to the employment zones reform that the state government is doing. So is there anything in the state government that the state government wants to do that we're arguing for or against in this submission? Or we're basically just saying we want a more fine-grained categorisation of the employment lands? Is that the main thing?
Through your chair, there's a couple of different elements to the state government's employment lands reform work. One of them is looking at employment land in terms of how much of it we need in certain parts of the city, whether there's a chance for it to be given over to other uses or changed in some way. That's not this project, that's a separate one, which we'll probably come back to you with at some stage in the future. So that, as Councillor Barlow was saying, that is a project where they might look at saying certain areas can be turned over to residential or some other use. This one is just contained really to the consolidation of the number of zones that we have and the translation of our current LEP into the new framework. And our objective is for there to be as little change as possible through that. But you're right, there are other parts of reform going on, but they're not at this stage yet.
Thank you. Councillor Curry.
Thanks, through the chair. So as a submission, so in the way that the state government is getting a number of submissions, so at what point is there community consultation on any of these changes?
Thank you.
Through your chair, this is effectively a planning proposal like other ones the council sees, but it's being run by the state government across the whole of the state. So they are proposing, so they're working with individual councils because everyone's LEP is a little bit different to get this translation piece done, and then they propose to actually put the whole thing on exhibition across the whole state at once. And the Department of Planning are going to run that as the authority who's proposing this change. I understand they're going to work with us in terms of how that's done locally, where the information is available and things like that, but it is being led by the Department of Planning, as I understand it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, through the chair. So when that comes back as a final submission, does that then come back to council?
Through the chair, that's my understanding, but I can take that on notice to confirm that.
Yeah, that would be good, that when it goes out on public exhibition through the New South Wales Government, that our community are informed and that they have an opportunity then to provide that feedback.
Thank you, Councillor
Do
Curry.
we need to, through the chair, do we need to add that into Councillor Douglas and Barlow, are you happy to add to? Thank you.
Thank you.
That council notifies, notifies the public once the
Thank you, Councillor Curry.
thank you.
Councillor Douglas, would you like to, is there any further discussion on this? Councillors McDougall and Souness, you can also contribute if you have a question. So, Councillor Douglas, would you like to exercise your right of reply as the mover of the motion?
I'm going to say that I do agree with Councillor Barlow that some of these materials are very in-depth, and I do think that if we had more time, they would be great to bring to a GM briefing, but I do understand there is a lot of time limits on some of these materials, given they're brought to the council late December, and we haven't had that opportunity. But I do feel like it is difficult to make decisions on these when we haven't fully understood all the materials.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Douglas. I believe some of these submissions would have state government implied timelines, so there hasn't been an opportunity for us to receive those briefings. So there being no further discussion, I put the recommendation on the screen, moved by Councillor Douglas and Barlow, with the addition of number 2, that council notifies the public once the Department of Planning and Environment places the matter on exhibition. All those in favour of the motion say aye. All those against the motion say against. I declare the motion carried. Now on to our last item under reports, CPE 22.006, submission to New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment discussion paper, a new approach to rezonings. Do I have a mover and a seconder? Moved by Councillor Werner. Seconded by Councillor Muscat. Is there any discussion?
Again, through the chair, could I ask for a summary for the purposes of discussion as well?
Through the chair. So this is another one of the state government's reform packages. The state government is looking to improve the processing times, I suppose, for planning proposals. Planning proposals are essentially rezonings, changes to the planning controls under the local environmental plan, so our principal planning controls. And planning proposal times are quite significant because of the amount of work that we have to put into assessing them. So we have to assess whether they have site-specific or strategic merit, and that takes quite a bit of time. So there's been concerns in various quarters that councils take too long to do that. This reform's really talking about reducing that time by streamlining the process so that councils move quicker, essentially. One of the key things that we've found in this review is that a planning proposal would be placed on public exhibition without council considering that planning proposal. It would also be placed on exhibition without staff having prepared a report to accompany it. So essentially it would rely on, I suppose, the information that was provided by the proponent, but they would do that in consultation with council officers. The planning proposal would be prepared that way. So that would be potentially a significant change because at the moment planning proposals do go to council before they go on exhibition. And I think in dot point on one of the summary pages there, you'll see that the Department of Planning is not proposing any more additional resourcing for councils. We think that there would be an impost on the council in terms of resourcing. There could be more spot rezonings coming about as a result of this change, rather than there being a strong reliance on the strategic planning framework that council's put in place with its local strategic planning statement, its local environmental plan and its development control plan. One of the other key considerations is the proposal is for, the discussion paper talks about an appeals mechanism for planning proposals that might go to the Land and Environment Court. At the moment, there is no such appeal in the Land and Environment Court, and the submission, the draft submission, does raise concerns around Land and Environment Court making decisions around changes potentially to Council's local environmental plan that it has essentially adopted, publicly exhibited and approved for gazettal. So I suppose they're some of the key things that we've raised, and I know that there's been, we've talked to our counterparts across the local area, this Eastern City District in particular, to identify concerns that they have, and I think our submission is aligned with those concerns as well.
Thank you.
Can I just through the chair? So what the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment are proposing is to take decision making away from councils and override the opportunity for councils to have a say on planning proposals. Is that correct?
Through the chair, I think not entirely taking that away, but deferring assessment of a planning proposal before it goes on public exhibition. So the council would still have a role to play in the planning proposal, but the assessment would not happen early on as it does now. It would happen after exhibition.
So the current process is that a planning proposal will come to council, and council will determine whether that planning proposal then goes onto the government, and the elected council can choose to reject or accept that planning proposal, correct?
Yes.
So in actual fact, what the department are trying to do is take away that opportunity from elected council to have a say in their area around what may or may not be a suitable planning proposal. And that is atrocious. Again, this is just another example of taking away decision making from local councils. And it's really not acceptable. And my question is, does our submission and in its detail, is it strong enough to put forward that?
Ms Harley, do you have a response?
Through the chair, council staff have adopted an objective tone in the draft submission, and we've done an analysis of the current situation and considered what is being proposed. The tone of that submission, I'll leave that up to the elected representatives to decide whether or not that's appropriate.
Thank you.
Thank you, through the chair. So then, I might wait in case other councillors have questions.
Are there any other questions from councillors? Councillor Barlow?
No, Madam Mayor's doing a good job. Banning the rezonings, and once again, I am assuming that all councils have got the same attitude. You're fighting a battle of DPR. So I'm hoping that if there's enough submissions from all councils, possibly we've got to go to the local members as well, because they need to know, even though they're in opposition, they all need to know what's happening.
Thank you, Councillor Barlow. It does seem like through these submissions that there are quite a lot of changes coming from the state government. Councillor Curry.
So can I suggest, if I can ask the movers, Councillor Werner and Muscat, if we make an amendment there and that we add Councillor Barlow's suggestion there of writing to all the local members in relation to that we strongly disagree with the proposal from the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment, and additionally that if the committee is open, that the committee makes point that we also, so even though this is a submission, there's also an opportunity to write to the planning minister, so that we write to the planning minister again, which I think we've done in the past, reiterating our total disgust at a proposal like this and taking away the decision making of whether something is appropriate or inappropriate for a particular local government area, where councillors themselves are familiar with the area and understand the impacts, where someone looking at a plan in the Department of Education has no understanding, regardless of documents that have been submitted with an application. So, and I also think we can, this just...
Oh, Madam General Manager, can I hear a response?
Through the chair, I was also just wondering whether councillors might like to move that this be raised by your delegates to SS Rock tomorrow night, and that SS Rock also very strongly object, representing so many councils with such vehement views about the inappropriateness of these changes, that we might ask our councillors who are there to raise it and to get the support of the whole Rock.
Thank you. So, Councillor Werner, are you exercising your right of reply?
I think this is a fantastic suggestion, so yeah, completely agree with that. I was just wondering who's going to SS Rock, because I know that it's clashing with the, I know this is slightly off topic, but it's clashing with the meat and, yeah, okay.
Thank you, Councillor Werner. Do you have anything to add to your discussion, Councillor Werner, as the mover of, or Councillor Curry, sorry?
Sorry, can I interrupt before your final? So, through the chair to the GM, do you think there's anything else that would be appropriate for council to do in relation to our strong views against what's been proposed?
But through the chair, at one point we did think as a group of councils, the Eastern Seaboard councils, there were going to be a series of mayoral minutes put up so that it could really be given a lot of oxygen at a council meeting. There was a suggestion that we do that with the more, I guess, political language that you can use, that you're free to use at a council meeting, as opposed to what a staff submission looks like. So we might include that as well.
Thank you, Madam.
Yeah, thank you, General Manager. I think that's a good suggestion, and I'll put forward a mayoral minute for the next council meeting.
I just want to ask a question. We've still got time because it's going to be a month overdue. Is that, we're safe for that because it's 20? We are, okay. Well, that's good.
And could I just say to that, even though the submission is due at that time, the campaigning doesn't have to stop at that date.
The submission.
The submission can still go through, but we can continue raising concerns.
There's going to be a month out by the time we get it through council.
Thank you, Councillor Barlow, and thank you, Madam General Manager. Councillor Werner, do you have a right of reply?
No, I agree with this. I think that's a great idea.
So, no further discussion on this motion. So, there being no further discussion, I put the recommendation with the additions that are on the screen, moved by Councillors Werner and Muscat. All those in favour of the motion say aye. Aye. All those against the motion say against. So there being no further items, I declare the meeting closed.
Can I ask a question?
Sorry, Councillor
Are we
Douglas.
allowed to do questions on notice in this session?
No, unfortunately not in the committee.
Not in the committee.
No, not in the committee, unfortunately. So there being no further items, I declare this meeting closed at 7:37 p.m.
I declare the meeting of the City Works and Assets Committee meeting open at 7:47 p.m. I don't think we have any speakers tonight. Everyone at the meeting is reminded to conduct themselves in a polite and professional manner and observe the code of meeting practice. Do we have any disclosures of interest? No. So I'd also remind you that the video recording is an official record of council and may be made available to persons upon request in accordance with the Government Information Public Access Act 2009. No other recordings are permitted. I'd like to begin by acknowledging country. Bayside Council respects the traditional custodians of the land, their elders past, present and emerging, on which this meeting takes place, and we acknowledge the Gadigal and Bidjigal clans of the Sydney Basin. I believe we have one apology tonight, Councillor Fardell. Do we have a mover and a seconder for the apologies? Councillor Souness, seconded Councillor Jansen. All those in favour, all those against, declare it carried. Sorry, do we have now any disclosures of interest? Noted Councillor Barlow, no disclosures of interest. We have no minutes of the previous meeting. Move on to our only report for the night, item CWA 22.001, stormwater drainage across the Bayside LGA. Do we have a mover and a seconder? Moved Councillor Curry, seconded Councillor Jansen. Do we have any discussion?
Through you, Chair, could we please ask for just a summary from the appropriate council officer?
Director.
Mr. Chair, this was a request for a question without notice at the February council meeting in relation to three main areas which they were addressed in relation to stormwater drainage across the Bayside LGA. A previous report had been furnished back on the 29th of June 2021 to GM briefing session outlining council's responsibilities and roles. So I'd like to just run through the main points of the report, if that's okay. So for a bit of background, it spoke about council's roles and responsibilities, the stormwater management and custodianship, council's 8 catchment areas, the flood studies and flood plans that council has, the proactive maintenance schedules, being mechanical and manual sweeping, and the creeks and drains crews and their roles, including gross pollutant traps operations, hotspot flood maps, recent stormwater upgrades, which has been to the value of $6 million, planned stormwater upgrades, which are upcoming. There was a conclusion and closing statement. The main findings within the report in the conclusion was that the street sweeping program that we have at the moment and the stormwater management for the maintenance is working very well. The custodianship, is shared between Council, Sydney Water, Transport New South Wales, the Australian Rail Track Corporation, SACL. Some of the independent data that we've got from Bureau of Meteorology also explains that even though we have increased developments, the severity of the flooding within the LGA and the frequency is about the same. Nothing's really changed. Most of the Bayside LGA is tidal inundated, which affects by stormwater surges, and the inherent site constraints is also an issue with the topography of the land. So all in all, the main points were that it's fairly complex, all the ownership and the people that are involved in the process. Not only do they have their own maintenance regimes with all these other organisations, they also have third-party relationships. So the changing environment with policy, state legislation also makes it slightly difficult, but all in all, from what we've just experienced in the last week, which has been sort of the most inundated rainfall that we've had on record, Bayside fared really well in that process. In addition, I have Council's Manager of City Works with me, who's a bit of a subject matter expert in it, and Manager of City Infrastructure, Jeremy Morgan, to answer any further detailed questions.
Any further questions?
Yeah, could I ask a few other questions, Mr. Chair? So, through you to the Director, what's Sydney Water's obligation in relation to the stormwater network that we have in place? That's my first question.
Their obligations are to maintain their part of the network and networks that work with in the council stormwater asset area. So some of our pipes will flow into theirs, their flow will run into ours, their flow will run into basins that they have to maintain and look after. We have no jurisdiction over how they maintain or how they look after their assets, but they're similar to us, that they want everything to be free-flowing and working well and working as it should be.
Because you mentioned through the chair, you mentioned gross pollutant traps that lead into the larger channels, for want of a better word. We are obligated to keep them clean and tidy, yet it's in their channel, it's in their jurisdiction. Is that right, or am I a little bit off the page? I mean, who does what it's not very clear.
Yeah, it can be both, but the majority of our GPTs are within our asset network. Is that correct, Jeremy? Yes.
Okay.
For us to maintain, and we maintain.
So the obligation lands back on us. I guess.
Yes.
Okay. Another question I had is, a stormwater levy is collected by Sydney Water on our water rates each year. Do we receive a percentage of that? Does the council receive no remuneration? So that maintains their asset pretty much.
That's correct.
And their
That's
asset
what the charges are for.
Okay, and our assets go into their assets, so to speak.
Or vice versa. Yes.
Or vice versa.
Yeah, so it's a complex network between all those assets.
Yeah. Because I've got to say, it's like, from what I see on just observation, okay, we've had wet weather, we've had a fairly long dry spell as well before the wet weather, and there was a lot of leaf foliage, and the council has done a fantastic job in sending the machinery around to collect the foliage that comes off the trees onto the roadway, because that builds up. It's a shame there's a lot of cars that hardly move during the day when our teams are out there, because they obviously can't sweep underneath the cars. But I've seen the teams go out there with blowers and do the best they can to move that constant foliage off the street, and that impacts on the stormwater runoff at the end of the day, impacts on the channels and blocks them and so on.
Yeah, it's predominantly hubcaps and metals and things that block up our stormwater network.
Yeah.
You know, you can hose your grass clippings and leaf off your driveway, it'll just come straight off.
Yeah.
And it just travels through. But yeah, our GPTs, I think we try and collect as much as we can through mechanical means, manual means. Through the GPTs, we'll collect a lot of our plastics and different bits and pieces.
So there's a fair bit of human pollution that goes down river constantly, despite our warnings and our requests to the community. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Just on the back of what Councillor Souness was asking in relation to the responsibility where they are state roads or water board assets, what is Council's approach in ensuring their accountability for maintaining those assets?
I might just pass over to Mr. Spelder to answer that question.
In relation to Transport for New South Wales assets specifically, we don't have a say in their maintenance regime. We ring their Transport Management Centre on a reactive basis to report any flooding or anything. And we have contacts with Sydney Connect, who's the new maintenance stewardship council there, and they've asked us specifically just to use the Transport Management Centre to report things through to them.
Thank you. Through the chair, so they do not have a maintenance schedule that has been provided. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So just, I guess to the committee then, would that not be an appropriate request, particularly when there's a number of issues that we've been having where we know that drains are not maintained on a regular basis, where we've got key flooding on a regular basis?
So that's probably worth adding to the motion.
I'm happy to allow that.
Can I say that through the chair? They are probably infrastructure issues. For instance, there was a massive one during this recent rain period on the Grand Parade at Monterey, and as soon as it rains more than 10 mil, it fills and people need four-wheel drives to get through. And I would assume some people would have reported that. But it's a constant ongoing thing, and I would say either there's no budget for it, or or Sydney Water. Well, or it's a mammoth task and it can't be undertaken easily because there's no budget for it. So is it something that we can go to Sydney Water or Transport for New South Wales and say, look, there's a constant problem, we can identify a handful of places where it constantly floods. Forget about the bottom of Bexley Road near Kingsgrove Road because that'll never get fixed. It's probably the lowest point in the world there. But there's other areas where we can pinpoint and say, look, we've had rain incidents. It doesn't need to be as bad as what we had this week, but there are incidents when there's less rain and it keeps on flooding in that specific zone. Another one is the Princess Highway just opposite that Walla Creek, just near the park there. That floods fairly often as well with a bit of rain. It dissipates quickly, but for that half hour when it does rain heavily, it is a burden to drivers.
Yeah, through the chair, I think we've certainly seen quite a lot of flooding issues over the last couple of weeks, and some across the state. It's been awful, and I guess for us, speaking from a Bayside context, we've had a number of flood studies done over recent years, and I guess several flooding events as well. And so in order for us to address these areas, I think it's really important we apply a long-term strategy. So looking at, as you mentioned, Councillor Souness, those hotspots, and then coming up with a strategy that then resolves to work towards mitigating those issues. So if the committee is open, I'd like to propose that for the next City Works and Assets Committee meeting, that council officers retable the flood studies with a summary for the LGA so that we can specifically see where those hotspots are, and providing a list of all known flooding hotspots across the LGA, including any new areas that may have been impacted recently, and then provide a list of the flooding hotspots and plans for long-term mitigation of these areas, including funding options. So that way we've got some that can be managed through good drain. It's important that the top ones are determined and that there is a strategy in place. Otherwise, it's just going to be a targeted approach to avoid those major issues that have a huge impact on our community, and their property.
Yeah, I'd suggest that be incorporated into the motion. Councillor Jansen.
Can I just ask what the scope of the...
Yeah, thank you. The role of the committee is really to oversee the process of understanding flood behaviour in the Bayside collecting data through to conducting flood studies, flood risk management studies which identify options for treatments or for property modifications and zoning controls, right through to assessing the options and the feasibility and the benefit cost ratio of the different options. So they have oversight of the whole process. State government departments have an interest in water management in New South Wales. So it's quite a diverse group. It's quite a specialised group that's focused on flood behaviour.
Through you, Chair. So does the Flood Risk Management Committee, are they integral to developing mitigation options that go into the flood risk management plans? And can they...
Yes, so to answer that, Chair, the committee is integral with looking at the options, so it's the nature of this work. The options are put forward to the committee to review. Once the assessment's been undertaken, to see what those benefit cost ratios are, looking at essentially what that will do is look at what the reduction in flood levels are, so the number of properties that may no longer be affected by flooding if we're to implement a particular treatment as mitigation measures.
Just have one more question through you, Chair. How does the council's flood risk management plan intersect with the coastal management plan that was mentioned in a report of the previous committee? I note that that's...
So through you, Chair, the two processes are related, but they are somewhat independent as well. So in terms of the issues that they're looking at, flood behaviour across Bayside isn't, so they are quite independent from that regard. There are similar sea level rise impacts and issues that are across both, and we look to have consistency in the way both of those are dealt with.
Through the chair, I've just got, just to ask, 14, we have a list of the flood studies we have done in the, it's a very good report and it was a really good GM briefing when it was from 20, whatever it was. But there is a list there and I actually like the fact that this is what we do. So there's a lot of knowledge there you can pass on to the community when they have a whinge.
Could I, we've just seen a massive flooding event and the prediction over the last few weeks. And I know that like a resident has written to me who said that since she moved into the area, it's been progressively getting worse. Since 2011, it's flooded in 2012, 2015, 2018, 2020 twice, 3 times in 2021 in her area in Bayside, Eastern Creek Canal. So I just wonder, is there an opportunity for us to capture some information from the community about who's been impacted over the last few weeks? Because to update this report, because the impacts and an indication of where things might be going in the future, given that we're facing climate change.
Look, and I think that this will achieve that. So, as I think, was I the mover? So I'm happy to put an additional point in there that that we have your say on where residents can put in a photo with an area that is not a one-off, but just so that we have the data then, if the committee's happy with that.
We've got to be clear also to the community that a lot of residences, and if not all, are built in a certain way, especially the newer houses. They're built to meet and probably exceed BASIC's requirements. Their drains are built in a certain way. They're designed for a certain quantum. Now people might say, well, my backyard's flooding and it's disappeared in half an hour. That's a big difference between what's happened up north with some of the country towns up there where we're talking metres. Here, if it's only localised flooding through their property, because what I can understand is those 10 flooding hotspots are generally infrastructure areas, in other words, roads. I can see Scarborough Park, the water level raised over the edge of the bank and sort of 10 metres in, there was water there. Okay, I can get that. But was there anywhere personal property was or that came from a public waterway?
Not as far as we're aware.
Yeah, because I didn't hear of anything, because you'd hear it on the grapevine, so to speak. But if there's issues of, I know for a fact, I used to work once near the back of Bunnings there was that canal there, I don't know what it's called. I went in the first time to work and they had their computer sitting on milk crates and I didn't know why. And then he said to me, well, it floods here every few months and we need to keep the computer out of the water. So that's something where they've built there knowing that there is the potential for flood down the track. So a lot of the residential houses wouldn't be in that zone, they wouldn't have that impact. But again, I'm asking the question because I don't know the answer.
Well, I do know, Councillor Sims, that this resident contacted me and I arranged for her to be in contact with Mr. To get. She has said that she is about to go door to door and put an action group together to lobby council to do action on that site to help. That's what the science is telling us.
Well, we're not here to discuss what may happen in the future. We're here to discuss what we've seen in front of us and what to mitigate. And then down the track, we can start looking at other things. Well,
I think mitigation measures are about dealing with the future. That's inherent.
Yeah, they are, but there are things in our face. There are certain things that haven't occurred.
And
I haven't heard of anyone had their personal property flooded out, apart from this particular lady, and we've got a lot of residents in the area.
With all due respect, Councillor Souness, I don't think anybody expected the floods in Lismore to be as extreme as they have been either. So we are facing an increased climate.
But without being rude, the floods in Lismore went to a certain level and they've gone up another 2 metres since their last event.
So our job
There's a big difference between 100 mil and 10 metres.
Councillor Souness, I believe there was at least one property in Botany Road in Botany where floodwaters did enter the
I don't have a crystal ball to know any
the
of these
property.
things.
But through you, Chair, can I ask if is there a risk rating done against the level of flood? As Councillor Souness said, that Bayside LGA residents haven't faced the same kind of circumstances as residents in Lismore or other areas. So how is the level of damage or risk rated with floods? Is that kind of work documented?
The Bayside, the Floodplain Management Committee, Bayside is prone to, susceptible to flooding throughout our area, our low-lying areas. It's not about all local government areas. But I think the statement that's already been passed is we have all of our modelling, and if we can look at those areas, pick out the top 5 or so in each of the catchment areas, have a look at them, see what plans we've got to rectify, if we can't rectify, or what the council was correct. And I did forget about that sandbagging of the adjacent fence. There might have been a couple of garages. I saw a couple of them in one of our neighbouring LGAs where they were pumping out low-lying garages under multi-unit dwellings where the pumps have either stopped seas or couldn't cope with the capacity that was coming down. But all in all, I think that there was only 2 other areas that we delivered some sandbags, and from the SES point of view, sources, because we've already got clean-up out there at the moment. More's coming out, it's heavier. People may be taking a little bit of advantage of that at the same time, but we're well behind with the amount of rain that we've had in all of our operational areas, no matter what it is. Mowing, the clean-up area is very difficult, and we've got a few more issues with a lot of the tip sites at the moment, transfer station issues in regards to waste, which I'll be speaking with the General Manager after this meeting, which we'll have to notify our residents.
Through you, Chair, is there an opportunity as part of identifying the top 10 flooding hotspots to provide potentially street signage indicating that it is a flood zone?
What are your thoughts?
My understanding is the flood warning signage is typically instigated through the SES, because there are some issues around signposting those particular, the flood hazard markers. So we'd have to have a discussion with them about locations that may be suitable.
And they're typically on state roads anyway.
Councillor Curry.
Can I just add through the chair, so just to the committee, so in the past where there was a particular flood zone, council had erected a sign which just said, please be aware that this area is subject to flooding. And so it's just an alert to make people conscious of where they park then in the rain. So I think to Councillor Jansen's point, that's something when the next report comes to council, we can potentially, once the hotspots have been determined, I think that would be good to then look at opportunities for signage.
Because I'm aware of that type of signage on Chelmsford Avenue in Botany, and there's a few spots there, and I don't believe they were instigated by the SES, but it's just as in response to residents contacting me and saying people are still parking their cars there and are still driving through floodwaters, even though the SES message is strong and indicates not to drive through. Residents or our community still do this.
Yeah, I presume that's
So how do you fix that?
alluding
Signs
to
can you put up?
yeah, alluding to
Tattoo on
signage
it.
around Walleye Creek and areas like that when we do have these major storms.
Councillor Douglas.
So, to be clear, this report tables what the issues have been to date, and we're going to update this report with the issues in this recent incident. But is there an opportunity for us to use the report that we discussed at the last committee tonight, which was about research into the floodplain risks moving forward in the face of climate change, to also flag, to incorporate that knowledge into this report so that this report does look to the future and looks to prevention and so that we can take on our responsibility to future intergenerational responsibilities, which is what we are actually mandated to do.
I'm unaware of the previous report that's spoken about at the previous meeting, but I'm sure that will be incorporated in all of Council's floodplain management studies now and moving forward.
I might just off the back of that, so I do think that's a good summary of all the, we've got these 8 floodplain risk management studies we've done over the last 20 years or so. I understand a number of those are currently being updated. But something that's come to light, I think, in the recent round of floods, and obviously this is a catastrophic event, it's not, we're not experiencing what they are in Lismore here, but we obviously have to prepare for these sort of things, and it's really highlighted that. But I was going through the last floodplain risk management study we did, and again, something that's come to light during this is that a lot more planning and studying is being done than actual mitigation. That's certainly been an issue that's been repeatedly highlighted in Lismore. So looking at this, there are a couple of recommendations for mitigation measures. I'd just be interested to see, have we taken any action on those? So for the officers, just looking through this, it's recommended in the report, and this is, I think, 14 or 15 months ago or something, this was completed, I believe, that we construct a detention basin in Burralee Park and drainage augmentation on William Street. This is the Botany Bay foreshore study. Have we done anything about those? Are these completed a month later?
We'll have to give
do we have a plan? Do we have funding?
Yeah, well, they're the things that will be addressed in the previous comments listed.
So have we done anything about those?
I just have to.
So how many? I mean, that would be something that I think we should really be aware of. Is I imagine there are. And I'm sure you're more familiar with these documents than I am, but I imagine when these studies are produced, they all recommend a range of, we've got 8 here, I imagine they all recommend a range of mitigation measures, I assume. Is that likely to be correct?
Yes.
And what do we generally do about those?
So what generally happens with those options? Because at that point...
And this isn't having a go at you,
No,
this is our responsibility, not yours. It's.
So these options that are assessed at this point are fairly high level. So what happens from that point is a feasibility study goes into play for those options that looks at it in more detail. The Burralee option that you mentioned from memory involves basically lowering the level of the park by a metre. From a flood mitigation point of view, it's an option that will reduce flood hazard. But from the site management point of view, taking a metre of material out of that park is not necessarily a practical option. So there may be other ways of achieving a similar result without doing what was suggested in the floodplain risk management plan. So in answer to your question, the options that are identified through the floodplain risk management plan are further reviewed for feasibility of actually implementing what's decided.
Yeah, sure.
Because these are purely on a flood basis. They don't look at other factors like the impacts of removing a metre of material.
Yeah, and absolutely. That's not, getting a consultant to do this report. I'm not suggesting we immediately action every item in it. But I guess what I'm asking is what actually happens when these recommendations are made? I mean, are there recommendations going back to all these reports that were done in the year 2000 that have, never seen the light of day?
No. So a number of actions have been completed from previous studies. And I mean, in an area like Bayside, relying on mitigation measures is an unrealistic option. I mean, some things will help, but the most effective measures are property-based measures, which are what we have in our DCPs, minimum floor levels, building with materials that are tolerant to flooding, so you can wash them out and repair, assist in the recovery after a flood event. So there are several measures that have been implemented, even with the Gertrude Street site. We're looking at investigating flood storage on the site. It's currently under a bit of water at the moment. But yeah, there is actions that have been implemented from these reports.
Can I just go back to my previous point? So just to be clear, that through the chair, that this report that we moved in the last committee, which was to the council officer to prepare for council's consideration and analysis of the impact of climate change on flood modelling and a draft policy recommending sea level and rainfall parameters on flood modelling over the whole of the Bayside local government area, which was passed. So when that is passed, that will get incorporated into this planning document for future stormwater drainage plans across Bayside. Is that correct?
So, I'm sorry, I don't follow what was decided in the last committee meeting.
I think, can I just make a comment, Chair? I believe that the report in the Planning and Environment Committee was policy-based, talking about the sea level increase statement and doing some modelling around that, whereas what we've got before us now is more operational measures around stormwater. So I think there's a slight difference there. I'm sure these things do overlap, but is that...
Well, that report, that recommendation was around parameters for flood modelling, and I would just like to know that we are taking into consideration the future needs of the LGA rather than just the present needs. So how do we incorporate those?
I think these are already incorporated in flood management studies, you know. As I said, the one I just opened up has a whole section on, you know, on climate.
These would be good to do.
I imagine what we're doing now will incorporate these considerations.
So I've just had some advice. So the answer is yes. So the report that you've just had from at the previous committee, where there's been discussion and agreement on what scenarios will be modelled in any future flood studies that are undertaken, those levels will be adopted. So there will be a consistent approach. So in terms of any flood studies that need to be reviewed in future, that's the basis on which they'll be studied. You know, whatever the agreed sea level rises were considered last committee, that's what will be adopted.
Yeah, through the chair, it wasn't just sea level rise, it was also floodplain activities.
More runoff.
So the rainfall intensity, there's a standard guide for Australia called Australian Rainfall and Runoff. That's the basis of determining the amount of rainfall for all flood studies, and that's a requirement in the floodplain manual from the department, from the state government. So that's the basis of the rainfall behaviour. The sea level rise is another factor that gets built in.
I was going to say, through the chair, we've got to understand that our infrastructure is pretty well fixed. In other words, the size of our pipe work under the streets, like unless we undertook a massive undertaking of digging up every residential street and going from this pipe to that pipe, we're not going to change the dynamics of the way the water's collected and run off. The only way we can do it is through the basic system, where we try and keep on water retention on properties, try and keep it there as long as we can, and then that dissipates out. The only issue with that obviously is it will come out eventually, and under heavy rainfall we're still putting the same old pipes under stress and under pressure. We can create all the reports we want in the world. At the end of the day, we have to be able to cost them and put money towards fixing the entire network if we want to make a massive change. And that's a lot of, we're talking a lot of underground infrastructure. And the thing is about underground infrastructure, you'll see through our capital works, especially the new councillors, it's better to build a park than to build a drain under the park. because you can cut the ribbon on the park and everyone will be happy. The drain underneath isn't as exciting to the community. That cuts, oh great, we'll just build a $2 million drain. Where you build a $100,000 park, it's all exciting, the kids can use it, and life goes on. One of the things I was going to point out to the councillors is we have an issue, and I'll divert a little bit only for a quick moment. We have an issue of loss of sand on the beaches down at Cooks Park, Lake Robinson's Beach. We have report after report. We've got a report recently that we need to do X, Y or Z. Now, there's no funding for that. And I can tell you every week the sand goes. And every week, down at Ramsgate, for example, there's a big black pipe and you can see more and more of it, and now it's sticking in the air. Unless we bite the bullet and say we need to spend X amount of dollars, we're not going to remedy that issue. And that's what's called mitigation in the short term. In the long term, it might be a bigger issue. It might be, in this case, build groins or do whatever it needs to do under that report, choose one of the options, but we need to bite the bullet and move forward with it. If we don't, it's just more reports and more conversations and more rubber stamps.
Councillor Curry.
Thanks through the chair. I think it is, as per the motion, though, it's important that we do have an understanding of what the priority areas are that do have the greatest impact, because a lot of it is, as you suggest, Councillor Soon, old infrastructure. However, we can't just ignore it. We've got to look at what our priorities are. There are some grant funding opportunities that I know that council are currently looking into. So let's try and get those grants and direct them to mitigation where it has the most impact on our residents, and then work our way through understanding that there are, we can't do everything, but let's get those key areas where there is risk, where there is danger. And secondly, I think it's really important that we put more pressure on the government. So whether it's transport, transport for roads, or whether it's the water board, in taking some responsibility for their assets that then have an impact on our area, whether it's our roads or across properties and so on. So from that perspective, so in that report then, do you mind, can we put that up again please, the motion? I think that motion then allows us to, so what we're asking for is, again, we've done a number of flood studies, so let's just get a summary of what they are beyond that slide in the pack, which has been really good for the residents. I've sent that link from today's committee papers to a number of residents as well, so which has been a really good tool to say, this is what council's doing, this is a really transparent process that they've appreciated being able to read and access easily. And so that then we get a list of our hotspots. We also hear from community, so we can take that into consideration as well. We then also perhaps as part of this right to, well again I guess out of the hotspots will come whose infrastructure it is, right? And at that next meeting then we can determine, what pressure we need to put on who to step up.
Yeah, we've asked for the proactive maintenance schedules, but they just don't come through to us.
Well, then we'll do it through council resolution and write that way.
Sure. Because some of the areas might be, for instance, that one at Bexley, made through the chair, is there's a little creek there below on the far side of Kingsgrove Road, Kingsgrove Street, am I right? And that floods itself. That little creek floods. So whose infrastructure is that? Nobody's.
Right, is there any further discussion? No. All those in favour? All those against? Declare it carried. There being no further business, I declare the committee meeting closed at 8:31 p.m.